Officer Ethan Caldwell thought it was just another routine stop until he pulled a gun on Regina Owens, the wife of the FBI director. Within minutes, his entire career collapsed. The flashing lights in Regina's rear-view mirror didn't come as a surprise. She sighed, her fingers tightening slightly on the steering wheel as she eased her black Audi Q7 to the side of the road in Brentwood, Tennessee. The neighborhood, with its tall, pristine houses and manicured lawns, was familiar to her. She had lived there for over a decade with her husband, Samuel Owens, the director of the FBI. But she also knew how this looked, a black woman alone in a luxury car driving through an area where people like her were often questioned. Regina's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror. The officer hadn't even exited his vehicle yet, but she could already sense what was coming. She reached for her phone, pressed record, and placed it on the passenger seat. She didn't expect the video to go viral, but she knew better than to rely on anyone else's version of events. When the patrol car door finally swung open, Officer Ethan Caldwell stepped out, exuding the kind of arrogant authority that came from years of unchecked power. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and in his late 40s, with a face that looked like it hadn't cracked a smile in years. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his belt loaded with tools of intimidation. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, his hand resting near his holster. Regina exhaled through her nose, bracing herself. Caldwell stopped just behind her window, keeping enough distance to force her to crane her neck to look at him. "License and registration," he said flatly. Regina kept her hands on the wheel. "Mind telling me why you pulled me over?" she asked. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "You failed to signal at that last turn," he replied. Regina blinked. She had driven this route thousands of times and knew she had signaled. She gave a slow nod. "All right," she said. "My license and registration are in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now." Caldwell didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared, his eyes flicking over her face, her tailored blazer, her gold bracelet, and her well-maintained nails. A slow smirk tugged at his mouth. "Go ahead," he said, "but make it slow." Regina fought the instinctive prickle of anger. She had played this game before. She reached carefully and deliberately, pulling out the documents and handing them over. Caldwell took them without a word, but instead of examining them, he just stood there, watching her, waiting. Regina let the silence stretch. Finally, he glanced at her license, and his expression flickered for a second before he recovered. "You live around here?" he asked casually, as if making small talk. Regina's jaw tightened. "Yes, about 2 miles down the road," she replied. Caldwell clicked his tongue. "Really?" he said, looking at the address again. "What brings you this way?" Regina laughed under her breath. "I wasn't aware I needed a reason to drive in my own neighborhood," she said. Caldwell's smirk faded. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said. Regina met his gaze. "No, you're not," she replied, her words landing like a slap. Caldwell's posture stiffened, his fingers twitching near his holster. The air in the car shifted from arrogance to something more dangerous. "I'd be careful with that attitude," he said, his voice dropping. "You're making this a lot harder than it needs to be." Regina tilted her head, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "How exactly am I making this harder?" she asked. Caldwell stared at her, the moment stretching too long. Then, with a scoff, he turned and walked back toward his cruiser, still holding her documents. Regina took a slow breath, pressing her hands against the leather steering wheel to ground herself. She had seen this type before, men who wielded their badge like a weapon, who weren't interested in enforcing the law but in enforcing obedience. She glanced at her phone, still recording. She had a feeling she was going to need it. But Caldwell wasn't done yet. He sat in his patrol car, staring at Regina's license. Her name wasn't familiar, but something about the address made him pause. He glanced in the rear-view mirror, his eyes narrowing on her black Audi parked under the golden glow of a street lamp. She didn't look nervous, and that irritated him. Most people, especially women, got flustered when stopped. They tripped over their words, rushed to comply, eager to avoid trouble. But Regina sat there, calm and controlled, like she wasn't afraid of him. That bothered him more than it should have. He wasn't a bad cop, he told himself. He had been on the force for over 20 years. Strict, no nonsense, respected. He didn't bend rules, didn't waste time with small talk, and sure as hell didn't take attitude from people who thought they were above being questioned. Ethan exhaled through his nose, still gripping her license. She had pushed back just enough to test him. The smirk in her voice, the way she didn't rush to explain herself, the way she looked at him without a trace of fear. She knew something he didn't. His fingers drummed against the dashboard. A woman like that, in a car like that, in a neighborhood like this, something about it didn't sit right. Maybe it was just instinct. But Ethan had learned over the years that his instincts were never wrong. He looked at the computer mounted to his dashboard and entered her name, Regina Owens. Married. No criminal record. No priors. Nothing that gave him a reason to push further. But his gut told him he needed to. His radio crackled. Unit 22, status check. Ethan lifted the receiver. Routine traffic stop. No backup needed, he said. The dispatcher responded, copy that, Unit 22. Ethan set the receiver down, staring at the computer screen again. There was nothing there, no reason to escalate. And yet he wanted to, because something about her was too calm, too sure of herself. People weren't supposed to be sure of themselves when they were pulled over. They were supposed to be on edge. That was what kept them from becoming a problem. His eyes flicked back to the Audi. She was still sitting there, her silhouette relaxed. Ethan clenched his jaw. He couldn't let her walk away from this thinking she had won. His decision was made before he even realized it. He shoved the license and registration under his arm, pushed open the door, and stepped out, his boots hitting the pavement with a solid thud. He walked back toward her car, slower this time, more deliberate. He stopped by her window again. Regina turned her head, her expression still unreadable. "Everything good, officer?" she asked. Ethan studied her for a moment, then leaned down slightly, resting his hands on the frame of her car door. "You got somewhere to be?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with something heavier. Regina blinked once. "Home," she replied. Ethan let out a slow breath, letting the silence sit between them. Then he did something he knew would get under her skin. He smirked. "Funny," he said. "You don't look like someone who lives in this neighborhood." He watched the change in her expression, subtle but there, a shift in her eyes, a flicker of something colder. Regina inhaled through her nose, exhaled through her mouth, slow and controlled. "And you don't look like a cop who follows protocol," she said evenly. The smirk on Ethan's face faltered for just a second, but he recovered. His fingers drummed against the top of her car. He could feel the weight of his holster on his hip, the badge on his chest, the years of power that had never been questioned. Not until now. She got lucky tonight, he thought, but he wasn't letting her go just yet. Regina's pulse remained steady, but she could feel the shift in the air. Ethan Caldwell was testing her, pushing to see how far he could go before she reacted. This wasn't about a traffic violation anymore. She had encountered men like him before, officers who wielded their badge like a weapon, who weren't interested in enforcing law but in enforcing obedience. The kind who needed to remind people, especially people like her, who was in control. Regina took a slow breath, keeping her eyes on him. She wasn't giving him that satisfaction. "If you have my information, officer, am I free to go?" she asked, her voice level. Caldwell tilted his head slightly, like he was amused. "What's the rush?" he asked. Regina didn't blink. "I have nothing else to say." "Either write me a ticket or let me go," she replied. For a second, he said nothing, just stood there, watching her, weighing his options. Then, without warning, he reached for the door handle. Regina's entire body tensed. She locked the door just before his fingers could wrap around it. Her heart slammed against her ribs, but she kept her face unreadable. Caldwell's expression hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying an edge. The casual, condescending act was gone. Regina stared at him. "On what grounds?" she asked. Caldwell straightened, his hand moving toward his hip. "Do I really need to spell that out for you?" he said. Regina knew where this was going. She knew that if she so much as twitched the wrong way, he would claim she was resisting, that she was being difficult, that she posed a threat. She also knew something else. He had no idea who she was. Regina exhaled, rolling her shoulders back. She had given him every opportunity to de-escalate. He had chosen not to take it. She slowly reached for her phone, never breaking eye contact. "I'm recording," she said. Caldwell let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Oh, you think that scares me?" he said. He leaned in just a little. "Lady, do you have any idea how many times I've heard that before?" His fingers twitched near his holster, just enough to be a warning. Regina saw it. So did the people in the houses nearby, a few of whom were stepping outside now. A man across the street, still in his work clothes, pulled out his phone. Another, an older woman walking her dog, had stopped completely, her mouth slightly open as she took in the scene. Good, Regina thought. If Caldwell wanted an audience, he was going to get one. She turned her phone toward him. "Badge number?" she asked, her voice loud enough for the bystanders to hear. Caldwell's jaw tightened, and for the first time, he looked unsure. But he covered it quickly. "I said step out of the car," he repeated, firmer this time. Regina didn't move. "Are you refusing to comply?" he pressed. She met his stare, unshaken. "I'll step out," she said. "When you call your superior and tell them you just pulled over the wife of the FBI director." The words landed like a bomb. For the first time, Caldwell actually blinked. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. His hand, which had been inching toward his gun, froze. The man across the street, still recording, took a step closer. "Did she just say FBI?" he muttered. Caldwell's nostrils flared. He wasn't backing down. He had come too far for that. But the doubt was there now. Regina saw it, and so did everyone else. But Caldwell wasn't done yet. For the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell hesitated. Regina saw it. That split-second pause, the tightening of his jaw, the shift in his stance. She had cracked something. But hesitation was a retreat. He squared his shoulders, doubling down. "Step out of the car." "Now," he ordered. Regina didn't move. Her phone was still recording, held up for anyone watching to see. "I asked for your superior," she reminded him, calm but firm. "Unless you have probable cause, I am legally within my rights to remain inside my vehicle." The crowd was growing. More neighbors had stepped outside, phones in hand. The tension had shifted. She wasn't the one who looked like a threat anymore. Ethan's pulse pounded. He had control. He always had control. But now this woman, this damn woman, was making him look weak. And weakness wasn't something he tolerated. His hand dropped his holster. "Last chance, lady," he said, his voice lower, now more dangerous. "Open the door or I'll make you open it." Regina felt it before she even saw it. That shift, the moment where everything became life or death. She had been in high-stakes situations before, had seen firsthand the way power was abused, the way a uniform and a gun could turn a man into a monster. She had been prepared for a traffic stop. She hadn't expected a gun in her face. But that's exactly what happened. Caldwell's fingers wrapped around the grip of his weapon, pulling it from his holster. The movement was smooth, practiced, too easy. Regina barely had time to react. A gasp echoed from the bystanders. A woman's voice cut through the thick air. "What the hell is he doing?" Another voice, a man this time, said, "He just pulled a gun on her." The street, once still and quiet, erupted into chaos. Regina felt a chill race up her spine, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't break. Instead, she looked him in the eyes and called his bluff. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The words sliced through the night. Caldwell didn't lower the gun. His breathing was uneven now, the reality of what he'd done catching up to him. But he couldn't back down, not in front of all these people, not with cameras rolling. Then, footsteps fast, urgent. A new voice, sharp with authority. "Officer Caldwell, stand down." Caldwell froze. The voice had come from behind him. He turned slightly, enough to see another officer, a familiar one. Sergeant Raymond Briggs. Briggs wasn't just another cop. He was a commanding officer, and his expression was pure fury. "Lower your damn weapon." "Now," Briggs ordered. Caldwell's grip tightened. He could feel his control slipping, but he had already lost. Regina could see it, and so could everyone else. But the damage was already done. Caldwell's fingers twitched around the gun's grip, but his body was betraying him. The weight of his decision, his mistake, was finally starting to settle. Regina didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply. She knew better. A gun in the hands of a man like Caldwell wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of his ego. Behind him, Sergeant Raymond Briggs wasn't playing games. "I said, lower your weapon," Briggs barked, stepping closer. "Right now." Caldwell's jaw tightened. His mind was working overtime, trying to calculate a way out. He had two choices: comply or make it worse. His nostrils flared, his fingers tensed. Then, finally, he let go. He didn't holster the gun immediately, but he lowered it enough to make the crowd exhale all at once. "Holster it," Briggs ordered. "Now." Caldwell hesitated. Then, with a sharp breath, he shoved the weapon back into place. Briggs immediately turned to Regina. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked. She kept her eyes on Caldwell. "I'd like my license and registration back," she said. Caldwell didn't move. Briggs stepped closer. "Hand them over," he said. Caldwell's hands were shaking now. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out the documents, tossing them onto Regina's dashboard like they were trash. Regina took them without a word. Briggs turned back to her. "Do you want to file a formal complaint?" he asked. Regina exhaled slowly, her pulse still steadier than it should have been. Then she leveled her gaze at Caldwell. "There's something he needs to hear first," she said. Briggs frowned. "Ma'am." Regina shifted in her seat, turning just slightly so Caldwell could see her better, see her fully. "My name is Regina Owens," she said, her voice steady. "My husband is Samuel Owens, director of the FBI." Silence. Caldwell's face drained of color. His lips parted slightly, his brain trying to process what it just heard. Briggs stiffened, his eyes darting between Regina and Caldwell, his entire demeanor shifting. Regina let the weight of her words settle before she added, "And you just pulled a gun on me." The bystanders murmured, gasped, whispered. The tension in the air snapped into something else entirely. Caldwell looked sick. For the first time that night, he finally understood what he had done, and he knew, without a doubt, his career was over. Regina reached for her phone and ended the recording. She had everything she needed, but Caldwell's nightmare was just beginning. Caldwell's chest rose and fell too fast, his breath uneven and shallow. The weight of the moment was finally pressing down on him. Sergeant Briggs's face was unreadable, but his silence said everything. The street, once filled with murmurs and whispers, was now dead quiet. Briggs took a slow step toward Caldwell, keeping his voice low but firm. "You just pulled a gun on the wife of the FBI director," he said. Caldwell swallowed hard, but his throat was dry. She was being uncooperative," he stammered, his voice weaker than before. Briggs's eyes flashed with disbelief. "Uncooperative? You escalated a routine stop into a damn incident. You pulled a weapon on a woman who committed no crime. And now," his voice dropped into something even colder, "now you're done." Caldwell's stomach twisted. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Briggs didn't wait for him to gather his excuses. He turned toward Regina. "Ma'am, I need to formally apologize on behalf of this department. This should have never happened," he said. Regina nodded once, but her face remained unreadable. She wasn't here for apologies. She was here for accountability. Briggs pressed his radio. "Dispatch! I need Internal Affairs notified immediately. Officer Caldwell is being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." A voice crackled through the radio. "Copy that." Briggs turned back to Caldwell. "Badge and gun. Now." Caldwell's pulse thundered in his ears. "Wait, he started, but Briggs cut him off. "Now." Caldwell knew better than to argue. His fingers fumbled with the clasp of his holster as he unhooked his belt, removing his weapon. It felt wrong to hand it over, but the look in Briggs's eyes told him there was no way out of this. His hands trembled as he unpinned his badge, the same badge he had worn with pride for over 20 years. He placed both items in Briggs's outstretched hand, but the moment they left his grasp, it felt like his entire identity was stripped away. Briggs gave a sharp nod. You're relieved of duty pending investigation. Leave the scene. Now. Caldwell clenched his jaw. The rage, the humiliation, the sheer disbelief burned inside him, but he knew there was no fighting this. Not here. Not now. He turned, avoiding the eyes of the crowd, avoiding the cameras still recording. Regina watched him go, watched the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable. But the storm wasn't over yet. Regina watched as Caldwell walked away, his back stiff, his hands clenched into fists. A man who had spent his career wielding power like a weapon had just been stripped of it in front of an entire neighborhood. The crowd didn't cheer. There was no celebration, just the heavy silence of what had almost happened. Briggs turned back to Regina. "Would you like to press charges?" he asked. Regina considered the question. The old version of herself, the one who had learned long ago to pick her battles, to avoid unnecessary conflict, might have said no, might have let it go. But that version of herself no longer existed. She thought about the women who wouldn't have had the chance to speak up, the ones whose names became headlines, the ones who never made a home. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I want him held accountable." Briggs nodded. "We'll take it from here." The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the moment would live far beyond this street. By the time Regina got home, the video was already spreading. Her phone buzzed with messages, friends, colleagues, even journalists. And then, finally, Samuel. She answered, already hearing the tension in his voice. "Regina," he said, his tone carefully controlled. "Are you all right?" She exhaled. "I am." Silence. Then something colder. "What's his name?" Regina closed her eyes for a moment, knowing what was coming. "It's already being handled," she said. Samuel didn't respond right away because he was already making his own calls. By morning, Ethan Caldwell was national news. His name was on every headline, his actions dissected in every newsroom. The footage of him pulling a gun on an unarmed woman, the wife of the FBI director, was everywhere. And Regina, she wasn't just a victim in this story. She was a reminder that power doesn't make you untouchable, that accountability comes sooner or later, and that no matter who you are, no matter your badge, your title, or your years of service, there are some lines you don't cross. Regina sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of the day finally settling in. She had made it home, but too many others hadn't. She glanced at her phone, at the flood of support, of outrage, of people demanding justice. And for the first time that night, she let herself breathe, because this time the right person lost. If you believe accountability matters, share the story. Let people see the truth. Let them know that power should never be used to silence the innocent. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more real stories that need to be heard.